to this discussion of women publishing and the literary press, the second of 2 panels live streamed today as part of our Festival of Women Writers and Journalists, a centenary celebration of Time and Tide. For those of you just joining us, my name is Catherine Clay, and I'm Director of the Time and Tide Connections and Legacies project. We're here to mark the centenary of feminist magazine Time and Tide, and to reflect in this panel on the status of women and of women's writing in the literary and cultural landscape today. As well as promoting women's equality with men in public and political life, Time and Tide was vigorous in its promotion of women writers at a time when papers such as The New Statesman pronounced upon the supposed intellectual inferiority of women and their presumed limitations as artists. I'm delighted, therefore, to introduce as our chair of this panel, Rebecca Harding, a highly successful marketing and communications consultant by trade, and the worldwide chairman of the Society of Women Writers and Journalists. This organisation dates right back to the late 19th century, and its members included some Time and Tide early contributors, for example, Vera Brittain and Clemence Dane. It feels particularly fitting to close our programme with this link back to the past through Rebecca's chairmanship of the SWWJ in the present. And without more ado, I'll hand you over to her now so that she may introduce our panellists. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. That was a really nice introduction. I'm definitely coming here again. So thank you. Good afternoon and welcome to everybody to the session on women, publishing and the literary press. And I've got a great lineup of guests this afternoon. We've got Nicola Beauman, founder of Persephone Books, which reprints neglected mid-20th century fiction and non-fiction by women writers. We've got Thea Lenarduzzi, who's a prize-winning essayist and also commissioning editor at the Times Literary Supplement. And finally, we have Catherine Riley. She's a writer and co-founder of the Prima Donna Festival of Writing, Creativity and Ideas, celebrating diversity, inclusivity and equality. So, Nicola, Thea and Catherine, welcome. How are you all?
All right, thank you. Yes.
Yeah. Yay, great. So now we've all received this wonderful souvenir copy of Time and Tide, if you can all see that, as part of this centenary event for the magazine. Now, Nicola, several of Persephone Books authors wrote for Time and Tide at some point or other, either as contributors or short stories. So is it exciting for you to see this in print? And was there anything in it that particularly grabbed you?
There's a wonderful review in this facsimile, beautiful facsimile, of A Room of One's Own, by someone rather interesting called Theodora Bosanquet. And I have no idea who she is, but Catherine will tell us. And it's a rather interesting review because it's rather poetic in itself. It's rather long and rambly, and it doesn't really tell you what A Room of One's Own is about, but it's sort of poetry. Did anybody else feel that it was slightly odd in that way?
Yeah, it sort of comes at it from a different angle, doesn't it? Or not even an angle, it's much more meandering than you might expect. Yes,
and I love that. And yes, it's absolutely thrilling seeing some of our writers. I had this problem, but we'll discuss that in a minute, that I don't think Lady Rhonda was actually a very good judge of literature, which is a very interesting subject because she was a politician, really. And so I don't feel at all happy about one or two of the contributions in this, but that's a whole nother issue that we'll get to about judgment. But yes,
and critic review. Yes.
Yes.
No, that's great, Nicola. Thank you. What about you, Thea? Was there anything that particularly caught your imagination in there?
Yeah, I loved. There's a short article about Amy Johnson, who had just completed the first solo flight from London to Australia, and the writer says, "What Miss Johnson has done, any young woman of like qualities, and there are hosts, can do. It's a question of a certain breakdown, conscious or unconscious, of mental barriers, a release from the conventional idea that piloting an airplane is in the first place a job for the man, and that the endurance and skill and mental balance needed for a flight of 12,000 miles over distant and dangerous lands and sea can never be found in the female." And then she sort of goes on to say, The important and significant aspect of Miss Johnson's flight is that she has demonstrated once and again that the sex division between male and female is absurd and obsolete, that both have to be regarded in the first place as individuals. And I just thought it was interesting to read that a few days after Kamala Harris was voted into the vice presidency in the US. And one of the first stories that the Telegraph newspaper ran with was, the headline was, "Why Kamala Harris is the modern beauty icon the world needs." And it was just that thing of focusing on, not on the individual, but on what gender she is and what color her skin is. And it just reminded me of the way that Amy Johnson was so often treated in her time, when she just pulled off this amazing feat of skill and courage. The Daily Mail, their headline was, she sets off with a closet full of frocks, which was just not even true. But again, we must focus on, they refuse to focus on them as individuals, and they just get completely hooked on their gender.
Yeah, it's so true. I mean, your comments about the American situation is absolutely spot on. So what about you, Catherine? Anything that you saw in there?
just before, we could do an entire panel on Daily Mail headlines about how women being reduced to what they were. I remember forget Brexit, what about Lexit headline, which had Nicola Sturgeon and Theresa May in their shoes, which is anyway. Back to my issue of time and tide. So I got a bit stuck on the letters pages. So I'm just going to read the entire note that was written by Mr. Groom on the 19th of June 1925, which made me laugh a lot. "Sir, I am pleased to note in the current issue of Time and Tide that you are not anxious to be addressed as Madam. I am one of your male readers, and although I know that the journal is conducted by women, I have always admired the clever way in which you have avoided making it a women's periodical. I like it because it is readable and bears no sex label." And so to me, it just made me laugh, because it's that sort of, even though it's written by women, it's actually rather good, like, well done, that kind of really, so it's quite patronizing male tone, and well done on not tainting it as womany. And it really reminded me of one of my favorite Margaret Atwood quotes when she's talking about the difference between the reception of male and female writers. And she says, when a man writes about washing a dish, it's realism. And when a woman does it, it's an unfortunate feminine genetic limitation. And that kind of letter to me summed up the double standard, really, which I'm sure we'll get into later on in this discussion.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's such a brilliant summary. I love the way you put that, because I mean, things have changed. But before we came on air, I was telling a story about something that happened to me yesterday with a man who didn't accept me as an interviewer because I was a woman. So, I mean, from your point of view, everyone, how do you feel that women's status in literary review journalism and publishing has changed since the time of Time and Tide? So where are we today? Do you want to kick off, Catherine, on where you think we actually are?
I think that we're still, women writers are still grossly disadvantaged by their gender. I think women of colour writers even more so. So I think there have been many examinations of the review press going back through, in the second wave, the Women in Journalism reviewing the reviews paper, which kind of laid it out as a very depressing read about the amount of coverage that women got, the amount of coverage that they wrote as well, which was significantly lower. And I think it's still the same, that this kind of literary double standard that I was trying to pull out with that letter, it's still very much there. So women writers are judged more as, so for example, a writer like David Nichols can write one day and it's literature, but a woman wrote that and it would be romantic fiction. It would be possibly marketed differently, it would certainly be received differently in the review press. So, and I think there's lots of examples. The Amelia report that Danusha Keane wrote last year or the year before had a really excoriating analysis of where women sit in the review press. So Thea knows more than me about this, but I think there's a way to go before we get to a better place. Yeah.
So what about you, Nicola? What do you feel about how things have changed?
I feel there's a way to go before we get to a better place, but I take it for granted, this is the terrible thing, about how active is one's feminism. I am so used to it, right back from the days when I was at university and no women writers were considered, apart from George Eliot and Mrs. Gaskell. It was even before the time of Virginia Woolf. It's sort of, I am so used to it that it's just in my DNA. A few things have changed a little bit, but not a lot, is what I would say. But that's very cynical and sad.
Yeah, it is quite sad. I'm hoping that we might have some upbeat notes. Things have improved by the end.
I can't promise to bring anything particularly upbeat because I would tend to agree. I think the novelist actually, so John McGregor, he describes how the entire culture and apparatus, he said, of the published novel, it was developed by an economic elite with leisure time on its hands, he said. And so he talks about how basically the descendants of that class work to perpetuate the environment. And, you know, there have been so many articles written about how you tend to commission in your likeness, in a sense. And within that, you can still, there's been an allowance, and there's been an increasing allowance, but allowance is a kind of interesting word, I think, for people who are what John McGregor calls hyphenated anomalies. So he talks about the working class writer, the black writer, the gay writer, the disabled writer, the woman writer. And there's almost perhaps a worrying sense in which if people can point to one, they'll say, okay, well, we've done that. We've got that. We've done our bit on that for a while now. So we don't really need to worry about maintaining it and keeping up the drive to diversify and stuff. And I just think it kind of, I mean, to make it a bit more personal, I suppose, when I think about my own time coming into the TLS and working in the sector in which I now work, not all that much sometimes can feel like it's changed from accounts that I read that were written in the 70s, for example. We ran a review a few weeks ago of the Fleet Street Girls by Julie Welch. And there's this anecdote that she tells about the day that she made history. She was the first woman to report a football match for a national paper. And so she sits in the box and she hears a voice behind her, "Women in the press box, so it's come to that." And it's just a sense of, I think there is still a residue of the knowing your place and not asking for too much. And I think that does persist.
So what we haven't mentioned is the old-fashioned word, the academies. In my view, the canon is dictated by the academies, by literary criticism, by academics, and it all filters down from that. And that is changing so slowly. It's still possible for people to do PhDs on subjects that I would think were interesting. They are allowed, obviously, to do Virginia Woolf, and occasionally they're allowed to do PhDs on the middle brow. And we're going to make a special corner for the middle brow. And then there's some women writers that weirdly it's perfectly okay for academics to write about, like Rebecca West or Storm Jameson or Jean Rhys. I don't quite know how they manage it, but they get into that corner. The canon resides.
They're the exceptions.
Thousands and thousands and thousands of wonderful writers who the Academy won't accept. And so I think it isn't just society not allowing women to commentate on cricket or whatever your analogy was, it's academics. And that is because the young academic, and I see it with people who've worked at Persephone and have gone on to be academics, they have to earn their living, they have to play the game, or they're not going to do their PhD and they're not going to get their junior lectureship. So nothing is changing, or rather it's changing, but very, very slowly.
So, I mean, you touch on there issues that you've come across. So what's affected you in your own life, Nicola? What has specifically been your
personal life?
No, just personally, in your own work life. What's affected you?
my first book was about these writers, and it was always considered, well, put it in the corner, they're middlebrow writers, it's completely uninteresting, because I'm not an academic. So yes, I do feel quite emotional about that.
Yes, I could see.
And then I always say to my husband, well, I should have been an academic. And he says, you would have absolutely hated it. And I would. And the reason I'm not is because I was bad at exams. So he always says to me, thank God you were bad at exams, because he's very proud of what I've done. So I think it's a very interesting issue. And actually, I don't ever think about academics or reviews, because we never get reviews of our books, almost never. We only get reviews if I happen to know someone who says to me, I will approach the literary editor of whatever, but otherwise we never get reviews. But I never think about it, because we are so phenomenally lucky at Persephone with our readership. I mean, I don't have to repeat this, but you know, we sell by mail order. We have 25,000 people on our mailing list, and we keep it at 25,000, because we cull people if they don't buy the books. And so I just don't think about these problems, but they are very, very real and actually upsetting that the world is changing so slowly.
Yeah. So Catherine, what have you come across in your life that sort of affected you directly in your experience?
Well, I can certainly relate to, I've done some academic teaching, I can certainly relate to the glacial pace of change in academic departments, which are still dominated by, not to be rude, sort of fusty old men who are quite, you know, quite intimidating to young female academics. And I think there are overlooked writers like Angela Carter, for example, who absolutely should be part of the literary canon, and you know, her omission from the Booker Prize is why we have the Women's Prize for Fiction. But there's so much more work to be done on more contemporary women writers as well that should be canonicized in that way. But I wanted to just make a kind of positive point about that idea of tokenism that Thea was talking about. So the working class writer or the black female writer or whatever. Because one of the things I think we were most proud of at Prima Donna when we ran our first festival last year is that one of our panelists, who had participated in a panel with 4 other women of colour, none of them were talking about the fact that they were women of colour on a panel talking about books. What they were actually talking about was their specialism, which was, I think, travel writing. And I'm very sorry if I've got that wrong. There are a lot of panels. But the point that I'm making is that there are spaces to, you know, allow women to have their specialism and to be respectfully treated and listened to in that specialism. But we don't. They're rare and they're few and far between. And we have to make sure whenever we're setting up events like this, we are always looking for the people that aren't at the table and habitually aren't at the table. And that's kind of the work that I'm doing now. And I'm lucky to be surrounded by brilliant women all the time. Lucky and perpetually intimidated.
I mean, the only thing is, one would have to say that modern young women are taken seriously by publishers. You know, we can't say that it now, in the 21st century, makes a huge difference if you're a male novelist or a female novelist. Would you agree with that?
What do you think?
I suspect you might get sort of pushed towards writing a different sort of book, depending on whether you're male, female, of colour, working class. I've heard enough stories from people who pitch a book to a publisher and are told, based on who they are and what they look like, well, have you thought about going in this direction instead? So I don't know whether maybe there still is a slight difference in the way that the process of publication would be handled. It's anecdotal, so it's not fully satisfying as an answer, but I suspect there still is a difference.
So Thea, in terms of the TLS, Times Literary Supplement, what sort of challenges do you face in establishing an equal gender split in the publication, either in terms of authors that you're reviewing or the people that are doing the reviewing, whether they're male or female?
Well, again, it's sort of split between anecdote and quantifiable stuff. And I guess the quantifiable stuff, the kind of the proven challenges, are the ones that we want to focus on, because they're the ones we stand more of a chance of having some control over, I suppose. Inevitably, though, the TLS sort of draws its reviewers predominantly from an academic sphere. So I totally, Nicola, what you said completely resonates with me about the narrowness of the academic world. And I do think that we certainly we're doing our best to remedy that. The fact that there are people like me commissioning at the TLS, and I didn't go to Oxbridge. I went to a decent university, but I didn't go to Oxbridge, which is something that I've run up against a number of times with people. I do think it's making a bit of a difference, but yes, we're limited in that we draw from an academic world predominantly. So that world is still disproportionately white and male. And if it's not white and male, it's white and female. Earlier this year, The Guardian published figures that were reported by the Higher Education Statistics Agency. And they reported that male professors continue to outnumber females by 3 to 1. The number of female professors has increased, but it's 1,200, which really doesn't seem very many. It's gone up by 1,200 since 2014. So it is a glacial pace. And among those figures, we also see that overall Black academics make up 2% of the total working at UK universities. So that's the kind of the sphere that we then draw from, more or less. So it does create an added pressure to find the unobvious person, basically, for anything that you want to have written, any book that you want to be covered or whatever. So add to that just kind of wider social pressures, including the economy, austerity, rising unemployment, the pandemic. These things affect certain people more than others. We know this. If childcare becomes too expensive, who's most likely to cut back and sacrifice their academic work or their writing work? If jobs are going to be cut, are they more likely to be the flexi part-time ones or the full-time ones? And all of these things feed into the makeup of an academic sphere that is increasingly driven by market pressures. Universities are run as businesses and they need to get the most out of every recruit. So we're dealing with a really skewed world or kind of reservoir of writers that we would tend to fall back on. And you also have to look at the fact that student dropout rates are on the rise. And I expect, this year is going to be really have a great effect in that sense as well. We're heading for even more challenges. I struggle to feel particularly positive about how representation, how much better we'll be at representation in a year's time than we were a year ago. So
yeah. I was interested in what you were saying about the Oxbridge aspect as well. And it made me wonder whether there are other constraints that affect women, where different excuses are used to stop women coming in. Do you feel that's true?
Well, men are much better about ringing up and saying, can I review this book, aren't they?
Yes, absolutely. And also, you can, even if they don't ring you and tell you, if you have a book and you're like, oh, I'll get this reviewed by this person. So you email a man. I am so sure that the first man you write to, even if it's not particularly his specialism, will say, yes, I'm qualified to review that. I will take that on. Whereas a woman is more likely to say, oh, I don't actually think I'm the best person to do that. And more often than not, will actually recommend a friend. Yeah. And that's again, that's anecdotal, but I've had that so many times.
That's an interesting point, because you're making a point that actually it's politically incorrect to talk about. We can't actually find the words to talk about the temperament of women being different. I don't want to say things, that are going to be recorded that would sound rather odd. But that is the big point, that women tend to ring you up less to say, could I review a book?
But that's not something innate. That's something that centuries and centuries of social socialization have done. So there was I was on a panel a few years ago, and the veteran news reporter Penny Marshall, amazing Penny Marshall, was on this panel, and she had a line to synthesize the hurdles that she had encountered, and that pretty much everyone on that panel, it was women working in broadcasting, had faced. And she said, tits, tots and tar. Tits as in the first thing is you will be judged on your appearance. Tots, you'll have to juggle having a family. Yeah. And then tar as in tar very much. The idea that we should be grateful to be there at all. And I wonder if that isn't particularly acute in the world of working with books, because we already feel so lucky that we get to do that as a job.
But this will change. This will change. I'm sorry, I'm probably older than all of you. You mustn't be too impatient. Things are changing. And now we need to mention what we haven't already mentioned is people's fathers. Okay, it's people's fathers can be incredibly influential in how much get up and go they have and how much women want to go out into the world. And actually, we haven't mentioned Margaret Ronda's father and Tide, because obviously this panel is talking about something else. But it's a subject which I find incredibly interesting about women and money inherited from their fathers and the effect of their father on their relationship with the world. So it is.
I think it's a great point, actually, because I know that in terms of business world as well, they're using the fathers of daughters to try and influence change within the business context to try and increase diversity. So it's a really interesting point. What do you think, Catherine?
I think, why not the mothers of daughters to try and change? I don't understand. I mean, without getting into a psychological theory, which is definitely my specialism.
That will happen. But in the last decades, it's been the men who've left the women the money. That is changing, obviously. But it takes a while. But all the literary endeavours that I can think of run by women have been funded by their fathers, and it's not something that we can talk about because,
Well, I don't think that's true either. There are phenomenal literary endeavours like Virago Press, for example, that was set up in 1973 and continues to this day, publishing women, has uncovered, like you, many kind of forgotten female writers.
It may not have been their fathers that funded it, but
it definitely wasn't.
I can name you the men who funded it. So my point is made. But it's changing. In 50 years, that won't be so anymore. But Virago was funded by men. So partly. I'm sorry to say that.
Partly.
Well. I think in the business context it's a bit different. It's more about getting men to actually lead the influence with other men and to change other men's opinions. So I kind of see where Nicola's coming from as well. But why do you think that it does, Catherine, why do you think that review press does remain so male dominated? And why does it really matter?
It matters because it goes back to this issue of gatekeeping that we've talked about. So if male authors are more likely to be published in hardback books are more likely to be reviewed, men are therefore reviewed, and it maintains the literary sphere as a kind of male sphere, and those are the books as we've talked about that get put in the canon and revered.
Yeah.
And it matters because it has a material impact. Women writers earn a quarter less than men, their male counterparts. It hasn't, writing is a business for a very few lucky people, and so those material things do matter. It matters that women's voices aren't in the public sphere. There are fewer call sheets when people at the BBC need an expert. It has a huge impact, a knock-on effect, that women aren't taken seriously by the review press across not only literary culture but culture more generally, I think.
That's a very interesting point about the hardbacks. Because for years and years, I've said we just must abolish the system of having things in hardback and 9 months later, that like a child, the paperback. But I'd never thought about it benefiting men. It's a really interesting point.
If anything, just from an environmental perspective as well, like it just seems absolutely ridiculous.
I mean, can you imagine how much the new biography by Hermione Lee of Tom Stoppard must weigh? I mean, I haven't seen it, but
it's enormous. Yes,
900 pages. It's nuts, isn't it?
I'm trying to read Hilary Mantel's latest book, and just in terms of the sheer physical effort of holding it up, it's it's an effort. It's an exhausting effort so far.
Yeah, I'm still trying to work my way through that one, actually. So, I mean, in terms of like sort of where we go and in terms of making changes, what do you think really works in terms of making things more integrated with women coming in? What do you think, Thea? Because you've done quite a lot on the Times in terms of changing things. What actually works?
At the TLS, yeah, I can't speak for the Times.
Yeah.
I don't know what they.
No, I mean I meant the Times literally.
But the TLS, yeah. I mean, I think the things that we found, we've only been collecting data since 2015, but I think that really has had a really, really notable change because we can map it, we can see it. So for all of the anecdote and kind of, social theorizing that you do, when you can see numbers there, that changes things. So we started collecting data with a view of parity, so 50-50 male, female in the paper. We started in September 2015, and the figures from there go to mid 2016, and it looked like this. It was male 64%, female 36%, and that was in spite of some editors really consciously trying to address the situation by, when you're presented with a known, looking harder, finding someone less obvious, rooting around in academia or wherever to find these people. So that was 64-36. By 2017, it was 57-43, 2018, 52-48, 2019, 51-49. Yeah. So we've not got the numbers for this year, but you can see a clear improvement. And I think this tells us a number of things. One, that the compiling of data, as I said, people's perception of what they commissioned was wrong, but they weren't able to see it unless we had actual numbers to show them. But people have a very skewed sense of who they are and of what they do and how they commission. So the data really helped. Two, leadership. One of the things that changed in this time was we acquired a new editor who deliberately selected every issue, or the pieces for every issue, with a view to reaching a gender balance. Three, monitoring and consent. People have to be on board with why they're doing it, why it matters, and the way that you're going about it. But I think, so conscious effort, basically, conscious effort we're talking about. But I think, and this comes back to what Catherine was saying, the major thing that still really, really needs to change, and I don't know how this will happen necessarily, but there's an ad in Time and Tide in this centenary edition. On the front page, it says, "Write your way to success." And it's this idea that it's an alternative revenue stream for anyone who wants to give it a go. But, I think most people who are coming from an atypical for the industry background, say they didn't go to the right university, or they didn't grow up in a house full of books, or whatever, they're probably not going to get through to someone who'll give them a chance. And even if they do, our sector pays people so poorly, for the most part, a token amount quite often, that simply isn't going to be, it's not writing, publishing isn't going to be an option for people who need to also pay bills. And basically, I don't know what the answer is, but I'm pretty sure what we're talking about when we're talking about getting more people of colour, non-males, people from working class backgrounds into print, it's still along the lines of what Virginia Woolf wrote about all those decades ago: space, money, and respect. So
that's very interesting. That's a really good summary. What about you, Catherine? What do you agree, and what do you feel are the biggest challenges in terms of publishing becoming more representative and inclusive?
Yeah, I totally agree with everything Thea just said. And some of the things that we're trying to do at Prima Donna is to create those spaces and channels that just aren't there yet. So we set up the Prima Donna Prize last year when we set up the festival, and it's for unagented and unrepresented writers who've never published before. And it's the reason we think it's important is because, exactly as Thea just said, those are exactly the people that just wouldn't find their way to an agent, wouldn't find their way through an agent to a publisher. We wouldn't hear their stories, and they would never become an established writer. So the prize, the last year's winner, a Glaswegian working class non-writer, she won our prize because she wrote a fantastic piece of a section of her novel, which is now going to be published in full length by HQ Stories in 2022. So that for us is a massive win. You know, she's a new voice. She's talking about stuff, issues, scenarios, experiences that are not often heard through mainstream press publishers. And so there's stuff to be done like that, you know, innovative stuff. And one of my sister prima donnas, Kit Duvall, set up with her first advance for a book, set up a scholarship at Birkbeck for a working class writer to do a creative writing course. So, you know, people lifting each other up like that is really important. But we need much more than that. We need systemic change. You know, the boardrooms of mainstream publishers were at the turn of the millennium quite female dominated. They're not anymore. It's straight, white, middle class men with the money power, and that's what drives what gets published and what we read, and that's the stuff that has to change as well.
And sorry, but also beyond that, we're how many, more than a decade of government that doesn't really value the art, not in a sense that to put money behind it. So we're stuck in a society that doesn't think that art should be paid for, and that of course has a limit on who's going to be able to create it.
And do you think that the current COVID situation, because people have got very used to having these sorts of things, trips to museums, online, and you know, is this actually going to be quite detrimental for women's literature in terms of getting people to feel even more that things should be free?
It's detrimental to all women in culture and arts, because when there's any kind of crisis, women are the first ones that have to pick up the childcare, that have to pick up the kind of freedoms that they had earned to maybe be out of the house working and to employ somebody else to clean. You know, those are the things that go first. And so, yeah, it's harder, not just for women writers, but women across the arts to do what they want to do right now. And it will only get worse before it gets better. Sorry, this is not the happy chat.
Negativity alarm.
Sorry, it's not going off. It's not going off. We're fine. But I was interested, Catherine, what you were saying about the awards, because that sounds fantastic. It really does, and obviously do some really good work. But I know that when women win literary awards for fiction, I know Nicola Griffiths wrote about this, it's usually for writing from a male perspective and or about men. And she said the more prestigious the award, the more likely the subject of the narrative will be male. So what do you think about that? What do you think, Nicola, about the awards that are given out and the way it's done? You got any thoughts?
I don't have a clue.
What about you, Thea?
Ask someone else about present day awards.
I feel quite torn about awards, and I'm speaking as someone who won one like relatively recently, not a major one, but still, you know, it makes you feel visible and it's very exciting.
Yeah.
But I wonder about I think the thing that I worry about is when awards are created with really specific remits, that quite often people can say, well, they're taking care of that, they're looking after that, so we don't have to. That award exists, or even that imprint exists, so that's fine. We'll continue to do what we do, and they've got that sorted. I always remember worrying a bit about the Women's Prize for Fiction, because of the kind of the concern that it sort of ghettoizes and kind of perpetuates that sense of these are women's books for women, written by women for women, rather than just being considered as books by individuals. But I also understand that sometimes it's a necessary part of a process towards the ultimate goal, which is invisibility almost. You're just an individual rather than a man or a woman or transgender or whatever, you know. So yeah, I feel an ambivalence about
I think the way that awards are helpful are as almost like as a kite mark for the reader. So in an industry that churns out 200,000 new novels every year, that's an impossible market to get into as a reader who just wants to be presented with something good. So it's almost So, and we know that the impact of being longlisted or shortlisted for the Booker, but also for the Women's Prize and the Jallet Prize, means that you will have an immediate uplift as a writer in sales, and that's significant. It's important. So if there are prizes, I totally get what you mean about tokenism, absolutely. And I remember speaking to Sarah Waters, and obviously she is a gay woman writing sometimes about gay themes, but she said she really struggles with that. Do I want to just be on the shelf as a writer, or do I want to appeal to that specific, it's a difficult thing. But the thing that prizes do is they monetize your work more effectively, and just in a crass materialistic way. That's a good thing. It's a good thing if there's a prize that's focusing on writers of color, because they'll sell more books, and that's a good thing. So, and it's a good prize if it's a good thing if it's a prize for women, because they'll sell more books, and that's, to me, is a good thing as well.
That's because we've gone down the road of reviews and prizes. Books could be sold in another way.
Yeah, true.
Yeah. So I mean,
for example, in the 50s and 60s, the Penguin catalogue came out 2 or 3 times a year, and that was a huge marketing tool, because one got the catalogue and thought, what's in Penguin now? There are just so many other ways books could be sold rather than just reviews and prizes.
Well, that's how you go about it, isn't it, Nicola? Because I was waving this on the screen before.
This sounds incredibly arrogant, and please don't think I'm not being modest. But I do sometimes wonder why other publishers don't do it. I mean, it's so cheap. Every time we send out a biannually, twice a year, we get 1,500 orders straight off, which pays for the book. And then, so we print 3,000 copies of every book. And then if we see that another 1,500 copies is going to sell pretty quickly, then we order a reprint. Why is this such a peculiar thing that no other? It's a mystery to me.
I wonder if it's because, and this, I'm just making this up as I go along, but I wonder if it's something to do with the fact that the publishing world has become so kind of consolidated around giants. So you've got Penguin, Random. So if they were to have a catalogue, it would be enormous. So they'd have to break it down by imprint. But what works so well for a publisher like Persephone or Fitzcarraldo or the indies, the smaller presses, Faber even, is that they have such a loyal following of readers. People know, if a book comes out published by Persephone, I'll probably really like that. I would like to have that. So there's a loyalty. Whereas with something like Penguin, it's so diffuse and they publish everything that there's no purchase.
They capitalise on their brand more. I mean, Faber, for example, when they used to be in Queen Square, I always used to think that there should have been a shop on the ground floor instead of just a receptionist and nothing else. Well, why don't they build their brand more?
It sounds like you need to go in as a consultant.
I was just going to say that.
I don't agree. We've done what we're doing for the last 20 years. They too could have done it if they wanted to. There are reasons they're not doing it, and I know what those reasons are. Which it's to do with, tying up everything with the big boys. But
But this is getting into sort of really good ideas about how things can be done differently. And I wonder if there are ideas that you have about how the future could be better for women. What could be positively done? What do you think it would be great ideas? And do you think there are real opportunities for women that will develop over the next sort of 20, 30 years? So Catherine, sorry, Nicola, you go ahead.
No, I was only going to say I don't want to be obsessed with the money. But since I run a business which is in profit, I think the money thing is absolutely crucial. And not until women can reliably run businesses which are in profit will things change enough. That's my view. It's to do with with being independent from men, because you don't need their.
I'll cheer you up, Nicola, because I run a business and I'm in profit. I know.
I don't, and I'm not.
And I can guarantee there are a lot of us around, so we've got quite a big network.
I know there are, but I do think it's an interesting point.
Yeah, no, I get where you're coming from. What about you, Catherine? What do you think's good and bright for the future, or could be done?
I think that not only do we need to diversify what is read and who writes, but I think we also the publishing industry still remains overwhelmingly white, middle class, urban, affluent, and there's just too little happening there. We talked about academia and the 2% of professors that are people of color, and the same. I mean, I don't know what the stats are in the publishing industry, but I know that people of color are grossly underrepresented at all levels. And it's that horrible adage, you have to see it to want to be it. And I think that there's so much more that can be done and should be done to diversify the industry itself, as well as the work that's coming into it to be published.
Are you hopeful though?
Of course, that's why we set up Prima Donna. It's like a little ray of sunshine. That's sorry, I shouldn't. That was a really depressing note to wrap up on. Yes, of course I am. Our festival. We had our first festival last summer, and we had a virtual festival this year, and we'll come back bigger and better next year. And we were overwhelmed not only with the writers of all kinds that wanted to be at the festival, their generosity in being available. So one of the USPs was that you could as a punter literally just go and speak to Elif Shafak or Bernardine Evaristo, and there was no kind of, I mean, it must have been quite terrifying for them, but it all went well. But it was an amazing way to connect to ideas and creatives and creativity. And you could also more pragmatically go and meet an agent and talk about your work and find those channels into kind of progressing your own career as a budding writer. And yeah, of course. I mean, I'm optimistic.
Great. What about you, Thea? Just before we go to questions.
I would say I'm hopeful, but alert, which sounds like something the government would say. Wash your hands.
I think you've got a whole new job opportunity there.
Hopeful but alert. There's so much to do, and that's in the industry, but it's also on a much wider social scale, and we need structures and we need support. And yes, Nicola, we need money. We need all of it. Yeah. We really do. So hopeful but alert.
Right, that's great, guys. Are you up for answering some questions now? So I'm just going to have a look and see what we've had come through. So how long did it? Oh, Nicola, this is one for Nicola. How long did it take you to build up your mailing list, Nicola?
Oh, well, about as long as it took us to pay off the seed money, which came from a man, 3 years.
Yeah, it does. The mailing list can be quite a challenge.
It's an interesting subject that we really should return to one day about the money. I've made it sound so superficial and glib, but actually it's at the root of everything, really.
Well, and it's the structure of society. It's where the power lies, is where the money is, and we know that it's an incredibly unequally distributed. So it stands to reason that there's truth in what you say.
But it doesn't have to be. I mean,
no, absolutely not. God, no.
Important. And then there's so many other fascinating issues, like I'm allergic to red tape and bureaucracy. And I actually find it's incredibly easy to circumvent it. But that's quite a male thing, isn't it? Anyway, there's so many interesting issues. So,
yeah, no, absolutely. We've got some other questions. We've got another one for you, actually. I'm going to have to put my glasses on because it's a little bit too far away and I'm a little bit too old now to read it at this distance. So, Nicola, can you tell us more about the process of choosing which books to publish at Persephone? We all want to know this. So, and that's
well, actually,
Faye Hamill.
We do have a thing on our website called How We Choose Our Books, because it is the question we're asked most often. But for the purposes of this panel, you will have noticed it's not just women. We do have our male authors who we love. That's partly because E.M. Forster is our lodestone. He's absolutely my favourite. And it would be absurd, therefore, not to have some male authors. But also, we're not the kind of feminism that rules out men. We're the kind of feminism which just equality is the only thing that matters, and therefore our male writers, which are about 10%, are as equal as the female ones. And other ways of choosing our books, well, look at the piece on our website. There is a piece.
I have to say, Nicola, you seem to have your fan club here this afternoon, because it was someone else who said, hello, Nicola, lovely to see you. And this is Mary Giannou. So it's lovely to see you, and congratulations on how to on setting up a brilliant publishing house. I'm a huge fan of Persephone. Please can you tell me which title you would choose to send as a present to someone aged 8 and someone aged 80? Great question. I love that.
Aged 8, we don't have anything. And aged 80, all our books. But if she hasn't read any of them, she could read our bestseller, Miss Pettigrew Lives for a Day, which is everybody loves.
Oh, that's great. That's really good. So now Faye Hamill, she says, this is one for everybody. So when I notice that I've accidentally not included any male writers on my reading list for a particular course in the English department, should I fix this? Good question.
Yes, you could add some E.M. Forster.
Oh, it's a great question. Right, Marianne van Remoetel, it's Dutch name, van Remoetel. I'm not very good at Dutch. This one language I can't pronounce. She says, thinking about publishing and reviewing as positions of power, I was wondering where and in what ways you feel you're making a real difference. So, Catherine, do you want to kick off with that?
Sorry, yeah, can you just tell me the question again?
Yeah, thinking about publishing and reviewing as positions of power, I was wondering where and in what ways you feel you're making a difference.
So we, in my working with Prima Donna, I hope we're making a difference in multiple ways. Platforming writers of all kinds and all genders that wouldn't necessarily make it to other literary festivals, creating new methods and channels for them for aspiring writers to get published, creating a prize that allows, actually I forgot to mention that one of the things about our prize is that we offer a bursary now of £200. So if you're shortlisted for our prize, you get £200 to create time and space to write your final submission. So things like that make a significant difference when you are, the desperate writer in the garret trying to eke out, any 20-minute gap so that you can finish your work. So I hope that Prima Donna and others like us are making a tangible, positive difference.
Yeah, and I do think though that sort of £200 of the prize and things, I think that support makes a real difference, because I'm a business writer, so my books are all business. So the kind of thing that if you want to get your granny to sleep after Christmas,
that's not the actual prize. I should be clear. That's just to help you get to the prize. The prize you win an actual person, you win an agent.
But I've started doing creative writing, and I'm doing a course. But it's really difficult finding the time amongst around the children, and because I'm a single parent as well, and it is really tough. So actually, little things that help make a big difference.
I think as soon as financial value added to something, it just legitimizes it in a way, and it makes you think, yes, I can spend some time on that because someone has recognized that it has a value.
Yes, that is absolutely
the way you frame it.
Yeah, that is such a good point, because even in my own head as a woman, I think, oh, I'm not earning for this. This is not priority. This, I have to put the kids first, this first, that first. And you do, particularly, and I think women really do that. So, right, Sharon Robbins says, what impact do you think e-publishing makes in terms of the gatekeeping effect that Catherine talks about? So, Thea, do you want to have a go at that?
I don't think I'm qualified to speak on that one.
Yeah,
I don't. I wouldn't know where to start. I imagine it might make a difference because it takes so much of the financial risk out of something. Maybe that would mean that people are much more willing to take a punt. But I don't know.
It does make a difference to women writers. Women writers are much more likely to self-publish, and I think I do have some stats, but not on me, about the number of sales have gone up exponentially each year. So self-publishing used to be, denigrated, I think, as a project. And I don't think it's that anymore. I think there's a growing appetite for it and a growing respect for that channel of getting your work out there.
And I suppose the advent as well of crowdfunding platforms must have made a difference. Things like Unbounded, where people who wouldn't normally find their way, as you were saying before, Catherine, to an agent and a publisher and so on, get to pitch direct to the public. And that seems to have had made a real difference.
It's interesting about the e-publishing, because for the Society of Women Writers and Journalists, we've just started doing some courses on self-publishing for exactly the things that Catherine was saying, that the sales have gone up tremendously, and it's not looked on in the same way that it used to be. And it's actually really popular. Everybody's really keen on doing it. And I think it goes back to what you were saying there about it being all sort of powerhouse publishers now. It's actually a lot harder to get your toe in the door when you're starting out. So it's interesting that that's where we're getting all the interest at the moment with our courses. Lydia Syson, she says, any thoughts about the growing gap between the incomes of male and female authors identified by the AHRC survey? I think it was a year and a half ago, wasn't it? Along with a drastic drop in income across the board. What do you think about that? So Nicola, have you got any thoughts about that?
Only that I think it's improving, but I've got no statistics. But my instinct is it's improving. When I wrote a book about the novelist Elizabeth Taylor, she earned perfectly sensible sums of money from her novels. And that was in the 50s and 60s, you know. So I'm not quite sure whether it's I don't know, you know.
I think what Thea said before was important, which is data counts. So that doing the research, finding out that all the pay gap reporting that's going on now, that's a legal requirement, is really, really important and significant in revealing where the gaps are and forcing change. And before that, I mean, it's not perfect legislation by any means, but it does push things along if things are legislated in that way. And data is how we identify the problem and solve it.
Yeah,
it does remind me though of 5 years or so ago. Do you remember there was that story, the Government Equalities Office, which was headed by a woman at the time? It was in the news for failing to recruit enough women to senior positions, and then paying men £2 per hour more than the women who were doing the same work. And that was in 2015 or 16 or something. So hopeful but alert, or whatever it was.
I think
you need to get that straight to Dominic.
Motto. Yeah, that's got to be the motto for this.
I'll get the t-shirts printed. I'll put them in the post. You'll have them by the weekend.
Excellent. And a final question. So, as a writer, what would attract you to a publisher? That's Ellie Reid asking us that. Just so, who'd like to have a bash at that? Catherine?
As a writer, what would attract me to a publisher?
To a publisher, yeah.
Them publishing my work. Simple as that.
I was going to say that.
Yeah.
What about you, Thea?
I think, well, I mean, my only experiences of one book that I've been commissioned to write by one publisher. So it's a bit of what Catherine said, the fact that they're interested in publishing me at all. But also, I suppose, the fact that they're an independent, it's Fitzcarraldo Editions, they're an independent publishing house. I know that they're interested and involved. And when they ask me about my work, they ask me all the right questions. I feel that they're connected with it and they actually care. They're invested in it, and it's not just a financial gamble that they're taking, because we're talking about very small sums and probably only my parents will buy the book. They're not getting free copies.
Absolutely not.
I think it's about having a good relationship, basically, having a good relationship and trusting their judgment. And I want to be edited, I suppose, because I am an editor. I think that's a really important part of any publishing process. So someone who I feel confident knows what I'm driving at. Probably better than I do.
That's great. What about you, Nicola? Anything to add on that?
And watching my children, 3 of whom are writers, they all are published by smaller publishers, which is so much better. Yeah, it's the relationship.
That's really interesting. So do you think it's your influence that's turned them into all into writers?
No, I think it's genetic. Well, you can call that influence. In other words, it wasn't me, but it's in the genes.
Well, presumably growing up being surrounded by books will have made a difference.
Yes. Well, also
Absolutely.
it's again, my anti-bureaucracy thing did not encourage my children to be lawyers or doctors or accountants, unfortunately.
Oh, that's brilliant. So I'd just like to finally thank Nicola Beauman, Thea Lenarduzzi, and Catherine Riley, and Catherine Clay. Obviously, it's been absolutely fantastic talking to you this afternoon. Thank you so much for all your input, and thank you everybody for coming along and listening to us. So I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. So thanks everyone. Bye.
Thank you.